Mr. Speaker, I wish to move now to deal with a very sensitive matter. I dealt with it in the House last year during the budget address. The Minister has spoken about it. This is the matter of climate change and the problem at Salt Whistle Bay. The erosion at Salt Whistle Bay, yes. Yeah? Yeah. Well, you call it what you will. The minister discussed it under that heading. Environmental problems, yes.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, you have 30 minutes.
13 minutes.
30. 30.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At least. So, Mr. Speaker, climate change and the problems that it brings and threatens to bring are very serious problems. We know that. Real serious problems. Especially for, as the Minister said, small island developing states. And I hope that we can have a program globally where there's special recognition for those vulnerable countries that have very low carbon footprint but feel a disproportionate negative impact of global warming and climate change. You have it at the United Nations. Every year. What do you have every year? Well, I know there are meetings. I'm talking about a program to deal with the concerns of those states to cope with the fallout. You know, when Dominica is completely destroyed, you can't expect Dominica to go and pay to reconstruct itself, when in fact we are saying that the intensity of the hurricanes is directly related to global warming. But they say the countries of the Caribbean are somehow not in a position to take advantage of the cheaper loans that poorer countries may have, or financial arrangements. But this is something that we can have a special category to deal with countries that have a disproportionate negative impact of global warming. It's not just Caribbean, it's also small island states in the Pacific. Some of them are having even greater problems than we have that may not exist in the Indian Ocean, yes. Maldives, that's the one I was thinking of. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, last year in his budget address, the Minister of Finance said that climate change, and I'm quoting him, is the greatest long-term threat to the development of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's at page 16 and 17 of his budget address last year. I agreed with him then, and I do now, about the seriousness of the problem and the need for us, not just the government side or our side, but for us as a society, to do all we can to mitigate the effects. But, Mr. Speaker, I also highlighted then the specific problem of Myro Salt Whistle Bay, because that is, if you like, nature's way, I think that's how I put it, of getting our attention on this issue, because it was so vulnerable. And the Minister, in his remarks last year, said that Salt Whistle Bay, and I quote, was one of the most beautiful beaches in the Eastern Caribbean, I would say in the world. Yes, he also called it, here's a kicker, quoting, a tiny sliver of rapidly eroding land, not less than 6 feet wide, is all that stands between preservation and destruction of this major tourist attraction. Again at page 16. A tiny sliver of rapidly eroding land. That suggests to me there's an urgency about the problem. So even as I called, Mr. Speaker, for urgent action by the government, because I said that, I made that part of my budget address. I said to myself when I heard those words from the Minister, well, he gets it. He sees how urgent the problem is. But nothing was done. Nothing was done, Mr. Speaker. Then, as now, he boasted about how much money that they had in the capital budget. Last year was $56 million set aside for environment protection. And more broadly for climate change, he said, no, this year was $56 million. And $82 million, or 37% of the capital budget, to deal with environmental protection. At that time also he boasted about the rapid rise in the contingency fund. At that time it's $12.6 million in the fund, operating for only 1 year. And the expectation was that there'll be more in 2019, so now it's up to $30 million. Which he said was set aside, his words, for a rainy day. And how laudable it is that a country, a poor country such as ours, could set aside that sort of money for a rainy day. I thought he meant the word metaphorically, Mr. Speaker. That rainy day meant a pressing, urgent disaster or something. I thought he meant it that way. And that any disaster derived from climate change would receive urgent attention. But I was disappointed. Because having acknowledged the urgency of the situation with the language that he used, there was nothing that was done that merited the urgent action. But 2019 passed, Mr. Speaker, and the honorable member for the Southern Grenadines who brought this matter to the House will tell you that the tiny sliver has gotten tinier and that the situation is much more urgent than it was. So now in the 2020 budget, the minister speaks of nearly $100 million. This is at page 17. That is planned in the 2020 expenditure on climate resilience and vulnerability reduction, of which a mere $300,000 out of $100 million is set aside for the Saltwater Bay problem. The contingency fund, has $30 million now. But even so, Mr. Speaker, if you say $300,000 as set aside in the estimates this year, I would have liked to hear a little bit more about what work is being done. Who? They tell us who is going to. They already have the architect who's going to design the acute referral hospital that they say they're going to build at Argyle. At Arnoldsville. Right? But nothing, just vague promises of $300,000 for the problem at Saltwater Bay. No work started, no specific plans, nothing mentioned. Yeah, you have other problems, like Yarabakwa, you got specific things that are being done. And in the budget, there are several other things that are mentioned. Yes, good. So, Mr. Speaker, the member for Southern Grenadines, he remains, Mr. Speaker, along with the people, my own people, myself, Mr. Speaker, I've been to Saltwater Bay a number of times, remain understandably anxious about the slowness, the slothful pace of the government's response to this problem. So I hope, Mr. Speaker, that the minister, in between now and when he does the wrap-up, he could find some way to provide greater detail to say, listen, I hear you. I get it this time. Let's put some plans in place to get this thing fixed. I call for urgent action on the problem at Saltwater Bay. It's not just a matter, Mr. Speaker, of a beautiful beach, as he suggests, being destroyed. That is important in itself. But it's critically important to the economy of Mairo, to the livelihoods of lots of people in Mairo, and the Southern Grenadines, as a member for Southern Grenadines will say. And I'm sure he will address it himself. This natural gem must be preserved, Mr. Speaker, because it is vital. It is very, very vital, very important to the economy of the Southern Grenadines. So, as they say colloquially, Mr. Speaker, enough talk. It's time now for action. Mr. Speaker, the minister also spoke about the solar project in Bequia. I told him last time he was in the House, it was mentioned to me. That's when I found out about it. I mean, I think, and the desalination project, that I welcome those as they are promised for those the community in Bequia. But, you know, I think they are potentially significant. And it's something that will affect or should engage the entire community. You know, so I was disappointed that, you know, as parliamentary representative, that the minister didn't say, you know, we don't do this sort of thing. We're going to have a consultation in the community so people know what we're doing. These are the stakeholders who are going to be involved. These are who they're supposed to be benefiting. And, you know, let's work together and get these things done. That will happen. Okay, well, I look forward to that because it is potentially the water project. I mean, last year was one of the driest years I've seen for a while. It wasn't as bad on the mainland, but certainly in Grenadines and Bequia it was. The place looked green, but there was no water in people's tanks. So that is something that I think promises, if it's done on a scale. There is a desal plant, a public desal plant, small project that was funded, I believe, by World Bank a few years ago. But that is not real. That's more like a demonstration project than anything that's seriously intended to deal with the problem of water scarcity. Actually, it's not water scarcity. We talk about water scarcity in the Grenadines. It's not water scarcity, it's storage capacity. That's basically the problem. You get enough rain because people with large tanks never run out of water, you know, unless they're leaking. So that is something that we need to address, and, you know, I'd be a willing partner with the minister in that. Mr. Speaker, I want to discuss briefly, because the member for Southern Grenadines will deal with it in greater detail, about education. I'm not going to get into much discussion on it, but there's an aspect of it which I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to. Everybody speaks about the high flyers in the system, how many people we're sending to university, how many subjects and how many graduates we have either on scholarships or at university, and how many university students we're going to put in homes and so on and so forth. But there is a big problem if we think that the education system as it functions meets the needs of our citizens. And I'm not talking here about the job market needs. I'm talking about basic education. Because what has happened, that problem was addressed earlier, and it's relevant, it's important. But what we find, Mr. Speaker, is that while we're talking about revolution in education and persons who get 18 and 20 subjects and so on with 19 ones, you have a situation where the children coming into Form 1, I know at my old school in Bequia, I've talked about this a number of times, that you have 27 children starting in Form 1, and by the time they get to Form 5, there are only 9 remaining. That is a big problem. So you have a situation where the ones who survive,
18 dropped out?
Yeah.
18 out of 27?
Out of the system. No. No, Mr. Speaker, this is not unique. I asked our research officer to look into this because I asked a question in the Parliament of the Minister of Education, and he spoke about 3% dropout rate in Form 5 and so on. Nobody drops out in Form 5. Very few. By the time you get to Form 5, you have survived. The main dropouts happen in Form 2 and Form 3, the ones who struggle in the system. And so what happens?
66% 66% of the children drop out?
I was at the commencement. I gave the commencement address. There were... Yeah, I was there. Yeah, I did ask. You check it. The minister, don't take my word for it. Go and look and see. Follow the cohort from Form 1 right through. Don't look at the dropout rate in Form 5 and Form 4. Follow them. See if 30 start in Form 1. Don't look at grammar school and girls' high school. Those are where the high flyers are. Most of them will get through. It's the average ones you're looking at. And see how many start in Form 1 and how many of that class are still together at Form 5. And then tell me.
Check the figures again. That is hard to believe.
It sounds hard to believe, doesn't it? Yeah.
Honourable Member, please move on.
Yeah, but this is the situation, Mr. Speaker. And this is something that we have to deal with. And part of the solution is technical and vocational education training needs to be ramped up and to be treated with the same level of importance as the academic training that we provide in the traditional system. That is as much as I will say with that, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, you have 13 minutes.
Okay, that should be enough, Mr. Speaker. Okay, Mr. Speaker, I want to address briefly a matter that is not dealt with in the estimates or in the budget. Well, it's in the estimates, but it's not in the budget. And that has to do with local government. Nothing is said specifically in the budget address about it, but in the estimates at page 479, it falls under the Ministry of Transport. And there is something there about what is supposed to be done by the ministry. You'll recall that in 2001, when this government came in, they set up a commission on local government. It functioned, and basically nothing came of the report. In 2009, it was also discussed as part of the constitutional reform. And, you know, I certainly supported the proposal as a good starting point going forward. The constitution referendum failed, and the government seemed to have washed its hands of that entirely. And part of what it is said at page 479 of this estimate is that the part of what the Ministry of Transport and Works is required to do is to articulate government's policy on local government. But I mean, I've seen no policy articulated. But what I see there in the estimates is that mainly this stuff has to do with minor repairs to infrastructure and so on. It has nothing to do really with dealing with the problem or the issue of local government. But I think it is time for us to consider how we bring government services more effectively to people in different areas of our archipelagic country. And particularly, the minister said in his budget address, he spoke about remote communities benefiting from the car SIP program. Well, I mean, remote from what? If you have local government that will have a certain jurisdiction as to what they can do, they can bring services. It used to be there back in, I think it was in 1972, it was abolished. This is something that I think will help to deliver services better to those communities where it makes sense to implement such a program. And anyway, I had wished that the government would have dealt with that in a more serious way. Certainly from the resources that's allocated in the estimates and the absence of any discussion of it in the budget address, it tells me that it's not something that's on the radar of this present administration. But it's critically important for the delivering public services and bringing government closer to people in certain areas. Because right now, you know, in Beckwith, there's a lack of coordination as who's responsible for what. How do you get anything done? You have public and private and non-governmental agencies that are doing things that tend to overlap. And so this is something that needs to be addressed. The minister also spoke about certain companies that are helping with his environmental cleanup or program. There was a company mentioned, All Island. Yes, recycling. Yeah. Well, I think you should have mentioned Action Beckwith as well too, because they're doing a hell of a job in Beckwith, and they collect a lot of the plastics that used to go to the landfills that are now being brought here, and that is all done by NGO with their own private funding. And so, Mr. Speaker, recognition must be given where recognition is due. There's another issue that I want from my own local community, my constituency. There is a program, Mr. Speaker. Early in last year, in May, I believe, there were some architects and town planners and so on who came down from an organization called RUDAT in the United States, and they came and they did a study of the waterfront of Port Elizabeth, all free of cost. And they came up with a proposal as to what can be done as a starting point for discussion. And they didn't say this is it and take it or leave it. It was presented as something that they brought their expertise to the community and said this is what we put forward as something that you might want to consider implementing. I think it's time, and there were persons from the government who attended some of those meetings. It's important, Mr. Speaker, for us to have a plan as to how we go forward for tourism purposes and also just from the needs of the community to make the place look better and more usable for the people who live there, because ultimately anything that we do has to be prioritized for the people who live in those communities. So that's what I would like to see. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member, Minister, at page 52, he spoke about the Grenadines as not being mere our little sister islands. I suspect he was referring there to the phrase from the national anthem that many have found, I myself, as perhaps not being inclusive enough and ought to be addressed, because at the time when we were changing the name of the country to include the Grenadines as St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then you sort of have these phrases that suggest that somehow we are not an integral part but an appendage to the national. So that is something that ought to be addressed. Let's have a competition to rewrite that phrase in the Constitution, in the national anthem. I don't think anybody will object. Mr. Speaker, I will just rattle through these. Again, this is for the benefit of the Minister of Transport and Works, okay? We always talk about this, and I give him my full support when he says that he's going to deal with some of these roads and problems. In my constituency, the hard-coated Paget Farm, please take a look at it. If you like young people, this is something that needs to be addressed. The Mount Pleasant Road, I spoke about it in the estimates debate. I don't want to run off the road again, but I don't want anybody else either to run off the road going up there. Please put some money into it to fix it. You had put money there before, you took it away, it's time to put it back. The Bluff Road needs urgent attention. No more studying. Enough talk. It needs to be fixed. There have been 3 studies that have 3 proposals of 3 different options, and this has been around for the last 5 years and nothing has been done. It seems the friendship to Paget Farm Main Road, it's an obstacle course. It needs urgent attention. The road at Spring, where the gutter has basically come in to touch the sides of the road, if it's not fixed soon, it will start damaging the road. A stitching time still saves 9. So address it before it becomes a more serious problem. Well, at Jeff Mitchell Airport, we know what all those problems are. I've spoken about it. It needs to be addressed. There's a Paget Farm jetty. I mean, there's so many problems, Mr. Speaker. The dereliction and decay that's happening in this country is really beyond the imagination. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member spoke about our position on the UN Security Council, the foreign policy issue. And it is a matter of pride for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But let's not, take pride too far, where it becomes that is all that matters is to pose. And you have a picture, and you're there, you're sitting around the table with the big boys. What we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is to make sure that this opportunity, which puts us in the spotlight, for good and for ill, we have to ensure that our domestic policies as well are commensurate with what we are recommending for people outside. Because our credibility, our influence comes from moral suasion. Not because you're in the Security Council, we're still a small, poor country. Our example is what will give us influence in the world. So, let's clean up our act here as well, before we preach to other people as to what they ought to be doing. We should also use the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, of the higher profile that the country gets. In the same way, when somebody like Kim Collins wins a gold medal, or Hazel Crawford, and so on, puts us in the spotlight, you use it to help to market St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to create relationships, to create benefits that may not be traditionally associated with such positions. But we are there for 2 years, and it may never happen again, certainly not in lifetimes. Use it to the advantage to help to market St. Vincent and the Grenadines. A tourism destination, as various having meetings here and so on, raising the profile of the country. Because one of the problems we have, is people have to know that you're here first before they decide they're going to come. And a lot of people, they ask you, well, oh, you come from St. Vincent. Oh, I have a friend in Barbados. Do you know her? There's a lot of people still have that sort of ignorance. So we have to make them know where we are, that we exist, where we are here, and what our interest is, and how we can get them to come to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And make them understand that, and to sell St. Vincent as a modern democratic country with its challenges, we want to keep it and make it a vibrant functioning democracy, one that people would wish to come to be a part of and to invest in. And that is how we can benefit mightily from our program there. Now, Mr. Speaker, finally, on page 68 of his budget address, the minister spoke of fiscal incentives that are available. And I have spoken about these as well with respect to the construction industry, the heavy equipment and so on. That it's better to have, the businesses importing better quality, newer machinery that will last longer and serve them better and serve the country better, rather than the government making a few dollars up front in the excise duties and so on. So if the reduction in the cost of bringing them in through the reduction in the concessions that the government is preparing, that is offering, that is something, Mr. Speaker, that we support, and the further it goes, the better. Because I think once you have a revitalized industry of the contractors and the construction industry and so on, then that helps the country overall. Hopefully these companies will take advantage of opportunities not just here in St. Vincent, but in St. Lucia, in Grenada, and so on elsewhere, because we are one economic space. And that is how we are supposed to be thinking when we're doing business now in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Mr. Speaker, I welcome also the Minister's belated embrace of the private sector. At page 40, he says that St. Vincent is open for business like never before. Well, I doubt that question about never before, but at least he's embracing the fact that private sector must lead the development. So let me see. At page 40, Mr. Speaker, this is what he says: St. Vincent and the Grenadines is open for business like never before, and the private sector, both local and foreign, is recognizing the diverse investment opportunities that exist in our country. And he says we have worked hard at creating, or to create facilitating environments for business, both legislatively and administratively. Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, this has not always been the mantra of this administration. Because you tell that to the supermarkets that they were threatened to put out of business when they came into office in 2001. You know, tell that to the contractors who still can't get their pay, their money held up, because the government rather pays foreign debt than to pay the local contractors who they owe the money to. And you tell that to Bigger Biggs, who lost his business, Mr. Speaker, because he supported an NDP candidate in the 2010 general elections. Those things send a chill through the private sector. And don't tell me they didn't happen. So now that you're changing your tune, this will, it will take more than just a vacuous statement, Mr. Speaker, in the budget to address this. And after all, being made in an election year at that, to change people's perception of this government as an anti-private sector government, which is what it is. It has governed that way over the past number of years because everything has to come through the state, the priority of the state, and then everybody else basically gets to do what they tell them to do. Many promises, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, but no money to fill them. The budget is an attempt. The budget, Mr. Speaker, is an attempt to convince Zenchans in an election year into thinking that this zebra has changed its stripes. But people are onto the government, Mr. Speaker. After 19 years in power, if you have not delivered for the people by now, instead of for a privileged, politically connected few, you can't do it now. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, 3 times, 4 times, shame, shame, shame on me. That's what people are saying. That's what the people are saying. And they will make that statement resoundingly clear. If you are in any doubt now, they will make it resoundingly clear when you're bold enough to call elections. Have a nice day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I know we have been sitting here for approximately 4 hours, and we have listened intently to the speech from the leader of the opposition, and we should join the debate this afternoon. We take 2 hours lunch as usual, so we'll be back here at 3:30. Let us try to be on time so that we can start on time and we can get a few speeches in, so that we don't necessarily have to take the whole week in order to present the budget and take part in the debate. I have an engagement to a higher authority when the sun sets on Friday, and you know that. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the meeting of this House be suspended until 3:30 this afternoon.
Honourable members, the motion is that this House stand suspended until 3:30 for the lunch interval. All those in favour say aye. All those opposed say no.